I don't know about you, but sometimes I catch myself remembering the choices I didn't want to make, the kind that follow you like a shadow. A few years ago, I had to choose between staying in a job that gave me stability or leaving everything behind to take care of someone I loved. I still don't know if I made the right decision. And that's the thing about life, the hardest choices never come with a warning, and they never come with a guarantee. The story I'm about to tell you is about someone who had to make a choice far heavier than anything I've ever faced, and honestly, every time I think about it, I wonder how he even managed to stand after everything collapsed around him. His name was Mason Hale, 28 years old, and if anyone met him for the first time, they would probably think he was just another quiet guy trying to survive adulthood. He worked as an audio engineer, one of those people who lived behind screens, knobs, blinking lights, and endless coffee cups. He wasn't particularly social, but he carried a warmth that made people feel safe around him. I only met him years after everything happened, but even then, the weight of his story followed him like it had carved itself into his bones. Before all the chaos started, Mason had a life that most people would envy. Not perfect, but stable. He had a long-term girlfriend, Clara, someone he'd been with since college. She was bright, charismatic, the kind of person who could walk into any crowded room and draw every gaze without even trying. Mason wasn't like that. He preferred staying in the back, observing, protecting. Maybe that's why they fit, she was the fire, he was the grounding earth. But there was one person Mason cared for even more deeply, even though he never admitted it out loud, his younger brother, Alec. Alec was 25, reckless, brilliant, and impulsive to the core. He had the type of charm that could make people forgive him for almost anything. Almost. Mason always played the role of the protector, even when Alec didn't deserve it. Everything started on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because Mason once told me that Tuesdays always seemed harmless to him before that day. He'd just wrapped up a recording session when his phone buzzed with a message from Alec. "Can you come home tonight? It's important." Normally, Mason would have brushed it off. Alec was known for exaggerating, calling everything urgent even when it was something like needing help putting together furniture. But something about that message felt different, short, direct, no emojis, no jokes. Mason felt it in his chest before he even replied. He went home that night, expecting maybe a confession about a breakup or some financial mistake Alec had made. But what he found was nothing like that. When Mason walked into their mother's old house, the house Alec still lived in, he saw Alec pacing the living room, hands trembling, eyes red as if he hadn't slept in days. It was a version of Alec he had never seen before. Not frightened. Not anxious. But broken. "What happened?" Mason asked. Alec swallowed hard. "Promise you won't freak out. You know, whenever someone starts a conversation like that, you already know something terrible is coming." Mason leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying to keep steady. "I messed up," Alec whispered. "And I don't know how to fix it this time." Mason didn't speak. He knew Alec would need to spill everything in his own time. Alec sat down, covered his face with his hands, and began telling a story that would change both of their lives forever. He had been involved with a woman. Someone older. Someone, married. And not married to just anyone, married to a local businessman named Richard Coleman, a man known for having money, influence, and, most importantly, a dangerous temper. Richard wasn't just wealthy, he was feared. Not formally connected to crime, but everyone in the city whispered that he had connections, dark ones, the kind people didn't dare to bring up publicly. Alec said he hadn't known she was married at first. But when he found out, he tried to end it, only she wouldn't let him go. Her name was Elena Coleman, and according to Alec, she was trapped in a marriage ruled by control and paranoia. She told Alec she loved him. That she wanted to leave Richard for him. Alec believed her, until everything spiraled out of control. 3 days before Mason received the message, Richard had found out. Not through suspicion. Not through rumors. Through evidence, photos, Texts, everything. And Richard wasn't the kind of man who reacted quietly. According to Alec, Elena had warned him that Richard was planning something, that he knew more than he should, and that Alec needed to disappear before Richard found him. But Alec didn't disappear. He froze. And now he was panicking. Mason listened without interrupting, though inside his mind was spiraling. This wasn't a simple problem. This wasn't something that could be fixed with money or apologies. This was the kind of situation that ended with lives ruined, or ended. Then Alec dropped the final blow. Mason. Richard called me today. Mason felt his stomach drop. What did he say? Alec's voice cracked. He told me I had 48 hours to meet him. Alone. He said if I didn't show up, he'd go after the people I care about. People. Not just Alec. Mason. Their mother. Even Clara. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Now, I don't know what you would have thought in Mason's place. But when he told me this part, I remember him saying that the room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. He didn't blame Alec, at least not in that moment. Fear does strange things to a person. Mason took a deep breath and asked the only question he could, where does he want to meet? Alec shook his head. It doesn't matter. I'm not going. You don't have a choice. Mason said it softly, not as a threat, but as a painful truth. If you run, he'll think you're hiding something. He'll become even more paranoid. But if I go, Alec whispered, he might kill me. That's when Mason realized something. Alec wasn't asking for advice. He was begging for salvation, from a problem too big for him to survive alone. That night, Mason didn't sleep. He kept replaying everything Alec told him, the fear in his eyes, the tremble in his voice. Mason knew Alec wasn't innocent, but he was still his brother. And family, real family, doesn't turn away when the ground starts collapsing. The next morning, Mason made a decision that would start unraveling his life. He went to meet Richard Coleman himself. Not Alec. Not both of them. Just Mason. He found Richard sitting in a private suite of a high-end restaurant, empty, closed off, guarded by one of those silent men who look like they don't flinch even when a bomb goes off. Richard's cold smile greeted Mason before he even sat down. "You're not Alec," Richard said. "No," Mason replied. "But I'm here for him." Richard leaned back, studying him with an expression that made Mason feel like prey. "Why would you do that?" "Because he's my brother." Richard laughed, not loudly, but in a way that made the air feel colder. Family loyalty. Admirable. Foolish, but admirable. Mason didn't respond. Richard tapped a finger on the table. "Your brother took something from me. Something I value a great deal. And when people take things from me, I take something from them." Mason knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. He also knew Alec would never survive this. "What do you want?" Mason asked. Richard smiled again. "A choice." And that, right there, that was the moment Mason told me he felt his entire world tilt. "You will bring Alec to me," Richard said. Or, he paused, letting the silence linger long enough to burn into Mason's nerves. "Or you will repay the debt in his place." Mason felt everything inside him go numb. "What does that mean?" "It means," Richard said calmly, "that one of you will walk away from this situation. And it won't be your brother unless you bring him. You can protect him, or you can sacrifice him." The hardest choice of Mason's life didn't appear with thunder or chaos. It appeared sitting in a velvet chair, spoken by a man who didn't raise his voice once. Richard handed him a card with a location written on it. 24 hours. Bring Alec. Or come alone, as payment. Mason walked out of that restaurant feeling like the ground was gone beneath him. He didn't drive home immediately. He sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel until his fingers ached, trying to understand how a peaceful, ordinary life had suddenly been replaced with something out of a nightmare. Here's the thing, Mason wasn't a hero. He wasn't fearless. He wasn't prepared. He was just someone who loved his brother too much. And love, real love, demands things from us that break us open. When Mason finally made it home, Alec was waiting. His eyes were swollen, his skin pale, his breath shaky. "What did he say?" Alec asked. And Mason, looking at his brother, his flawed, desperate, terrified brother, felt the full weight of the world slam into him. "He gave me a choice," Mason whispered. Alec's throat tightened. "I can't face him. I can't do it." And that was when Mason realized. Alec had already made his choice. He chose himself. He chose survival. He chose fear. Leaving Mason to choose everything else. I remember when he told me this part of the story, his voice went soft. Not sad, but tired. Like the exhaustion never fully left him. He said, "I looked at Alec and knew, if anyone was going to sacrifice something, it had to be me. My whole life, I protected him. Even from himself. But the decision wasn't that simple. Mason had Clara. He had a career. He had a future. Stepping into Alec's place meant losing everything he had built. It meant possibly losing his life. Yet leaving Alec to face Richard meant betraying the only person he had ever sworn to protect. That night, something inside Mason fractured. He walked into the kitchen, sat down, and stared at the wall for nearly an hour. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He just weighed every consequence, every possibility, every memory. When he finally stood up, he knew what he had to do. The next morning, before the sun rose, Mason packed a small bag. Just a few things, enough to make it look like he wasn't walking toward his own end. He wrote Clara a letter. He didn't tell her the truth, he just apologized for everything and told her he loved her more than she would ever understand. Then he went to Alec's room, opened the door quietly, and looked at his brother sleeping. Mason stood there for a long time, memorizing his face, knowing it might be the last time he saw him alive. Then he whispered, "I hope one day you forgive me." And he left. He drove to the location Richard had given him, a warehouse on the edge of the city, abandoned years ago. Every step he took inside felt like walking into a storm he couldn't outrun. But he kept walking. Because Mason had made his choice. A choice that would define everything. A choice that would cost him far more than he imagined. When Mason stepped inside the warehouse, the first thing he noticed was the silence, an oppressive, heavy kind of silence that made every breath echo. The air smelled like dust and metal, and the faint sunlight leaking through the broken windows painted the abandoned space in fractured lines. It felt like walking into the mouth of something alive and waiting. I remember Mason telling me that he hesitated for a second, just 1 second, right before crossing a line of shadows that separated the entrance from the deeper part of the warehouse. He said that moment felt like standing at the border of two lives, the life he had, and the life he was willingly giving up. A figure stepped out from the far end, a tall man in a dark coat, expressionless, almost unreal in the dim light. Not Richard. One of his men. "You came alone," the man said, voice cold enough to scrape. Mason nodded. "Follow me." He didn't ask where. He didn't ask why. He just followed. They walked through a maze of rusted metal beams and abandoned machinery until they reached a closed door. The man pushed it open. Inside, sitting at a small table with a glass of whiskey, was Richard Coleman. He didn't look surprised to see Mason. If anything, he looked satisfied. "Mason," Richard said calmly. "A man of honor. Don't see many of those anymore." Mason's hands tightened into fists at his sides, but he stayed silent. Richard gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Sit." Mason obeyed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Then Richard leaned forward slightly. Your brother didn't come. There was no accusation in his tone. No anger. Just fact. I knew he wouldn't, Mason replied, voice steady. That's why I'm here. Richard studied him, eyes sharp but unreadable. Do you understand what stepping in for him means? Yes. You're willing to face the consequences of his actions? Yes. Richard tilted his head. Even though he betrayed you? Betrayed your family? Mason didn't flinch. He's still my brother. Richard let out a slow breath, almost amused. Family loyalty. I used to respect that. Before Elena forgot what loyalty meant. There it was, the first crack in Richard's mask. The pain beneath the fury. The wound behind the violence. Mason spoke quietly. Did you love her? Richard's eyes hardened instantly. Enough to give her everything. Enough to forgive her mistakes. But she didn't love me back. She loved the thrill. The danger. The attention. Mason didn't argue. He didn't judge. He simply let Richard talk, hoping maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end. Maybe Richard needed someone to listen more than he needed revenge. But Richard wasn't looking for peace. He was looking for balance. Payment. Order. Your brother humiliated me, Richard said. He put me in a position I will not forgive. So I need something in return. Mason swallowed. What do you want from me? Richard reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. He slid it across the table. Inside was a photograph. A photograph of Clara. Mason's heart dropped. Richard noticed the shift in his breathing. She means a lot to you. Mason didn't answer. Richard tapped the table. I don't need your life, Mason. Killing you would be too easy. Too fast. Too forgettable. He leaned closer. What I need, is a choice. Mason braced himself. You will disappear, Richard said. You will cut ties with everyone you love, your brother, your girlfriend, your career. You will become a ghost. And you will never, ever speak of this to anyone. Mason stared at him, shock spreading slowly like cold water. Or, Richard continued, I will go after Clara. And believe me, I won't hurt her quickly. The room spun. This wasn't a choice between his life and Alex. This was a choice between Mason's soul and Clara's safety. If you vanish, Richard said, your brother lives. Clara lives. You live. But you will lose everything. You will live in the shadows, nameless. You will watch your life crumble from afar. That is the price. Mason felt a tremor move through him, not fear, but the unsteady realization that his life was no longer his own. He could run. Fight. Beg. But none of those options would protect Clara. He knew it. And Richard knew he knew it. Mason closed his eyes for a moment. He saw Clara laughing in the kitchen the night before, humming while she made tea. He saw the way she pushed her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. He saw the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, like he was her whole world. He opened his eyes again. I'll disappear, Mason whispered. Richard smiled, not cruelly but with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had restored balance to his universe. Good, Richard said. You have 12 hours. After that, if you're still reachable, I will assume you chose the other option. And just like that, Mason's fate was sealed. The man who escorted Mason into the warehouse escorted him out. No threats, no violence, no handcuffs. Because Richard knew he didn't need any of that. The threat was enough. When Mason stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a wall. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, palms sweating, chest tight. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't break. He just accepted. It's strange how quiet the world becomes when your future is gone. Mason drove home one last time. When he entered the apartment he shared with Clara, the lights were off, but her jacket was on the chair, her shoes by the door. She was home. He walked inside quietly, trying not to wake her. Every detail of the apartment felt sharper, like he was memorizing it unconsciously. The framed photos. The books she loved. The faint smell of lavender she always used before bed. He walked into the bedroom and found her asleep, curled under the blanket, her face soft and peaceful. He stood there for a long time, longer than he could explain, trying to burn the image into his memory. He knew he couldn't wake her. If he did, she would ask questions he couldn't answer. So he placed a letter on her nightstand, the same one he had written before visiting Richard. Now the words inside felt heavier. He whispered, so quietly she couldn't hear, "I love you. I'm sorry." Then he left. He didn't take much, just a backpack, his ID, some cash, and his phone. Not that he would keep the phone for long. Driving away from the apartment felt like tearing himself in half. He pulled over at a gas station outside the city, sat on the curb, and stared at the sky. He told me later that night was the first time he truly understood what grief felt like, the kind of grief that's still alive, breathing, pulsing, refusing to fade. After a few hours, he turned off his phone, removed the SIM card, and threw it into a dumpster. From that moment forward, Mason Hale no longer existed in the world he once knew. He bought a bus ticket under a false name. Then another. And another. Until he was somewhere far enough that no one would think to look for him. Weeks passed. Then months. Mason found small jobs, construction, night shifts at rundown motels, stacking boxes in warehouses. He kept his head down. Avoided attention. Lived in rented rooms where no one asked questions. He checked the news every few weeks, searching for mention of Clara. Or Alec. Or Richard. There was nothing. Which meant Richard was satisfied. Which meant Clara was safe. Which meant Alec still had a chance. But Mason didn't. One night, nearly a year after he disappeared, Mason found himself sitting alone outside a small diner in a town whose name he couldn't remember. He was eating cold fries, staring at the empty street, when suddenly he felt a familiar ache in his chest. Until that moment, he'd convinced himself his sacrifice was worth it. But that night, for the first time, he felt doubt. Had he condemned himself for nothing? Would Clara ever forgive him for vanishing without explanation? Would Alec ever change? Did Richard really keep his word? Questions without answers. Questions that gnawed at him like slow poison. As he told me this part of the story, he laughed softly and said, "Funny thing about disappearing, you start disappearing from yourself too. But fate has a strange way of circling back." Because one morning, everything changed again. Mason went to a convenience store before work, grabbed a coffee, and walked to the counter. The cashier, a teenage girl scrolling her phone, glanced up for a moment, just long enough to look at him, then look back at the screen. She froze. Stared again. Then asked softly, "Are you Mason Hale?" His entire body went cold. He shook his head immediately. "No. You've got the wrong person." But the girl cautiously turned her phone toward him. There on her screen was an online post. A missing person flyer. His face. His name. And beneath it, a message that felt like a knife stabbed into his chest. "If you see him, please contact me. I just want to know he's alive. Clara." It had been posted 3 days earlier. Clara was still looking for him. She hadn't moved on. She hadn't accepted his disappearance. She hadn't even stopped searching. Mason's hands shook so violently that the coffee cup slipped from his grip and shattered on the floor. The cashier took a step back, startled. I'm sorry," Mason stammered. It's not me. I swear. But his voice betrayed him. His eyes betrayed him. His trembling betrayed him. He left the store without buying anything, heart pounding like thunder. If Clara was still looking for him, she was in danger. Not because Richard would hurt her now, but because Richard would see her trying to uncover the truth, and he would not tolerate loose ends. Mason had two options. Stay hidden and hope Clara eventually gave up. Or go back, and risk everything again. He spent the entire day pacing in his small rented room, replaying every memory of her. Their last morning together. Her sleeping face. The letter he left behind. He knew she deserved the truth. But the truth carried a death sentence. That night, he didn't sleep. By sunrise, Mason made a decision. He packed his bag once more. He bought the earliest bus ticket back to the city. He would find Clara. Explain everything. And hope, somehow, that Richard wouldn't notice. But fate rarely gives second chances without demanding something in return. When Mason arrived back in the city, he felt like he was walking through a dream. The familiar streets, the familiar buildings, the same smells and sounds, everything felt close yet unreachable, like he was moving beneath a different layer of reality. He walked to Clara's building at sunset, heart hammering so hard he could barely breathe. He didn't know what he would say, how she would react, or what she believed about his disappearance. But he needed to see her. Even if it destroyed everything. He reached her door. Lifted his hand. And knocked. Once. Twice. Silence. Then footsteps. The door opened slightly, chain still on. Clara's face appeared through the crack. At first, she didn't react. She just stared. Then her eyes widened. Her hand trembled. "Mason," she whispered. His heart cracked open. "Clara. I'm sorry." The chain fell. The door flew open. She wrapped her arms around him so tightly he could barely breathe. She sobbed into his shoulder, raw, shaking sobs that broke him to pieces. "You're alive," she cried. "You're alive. I thought you." He held her, trying to steady his own shaking. "I never wanted to leave. I had to." She pulled back, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Why? Why would you disappear like that?" He opened his mouth. But before he could speak, a voice echoed from the hallway behind her. "Well," the voice said. "Isn't this a touching reunion?" Mason froze. Clara turned around slowly. Standing at the end of the hallway was Richard Coleman. Not alone. Two of his men stood behind him, silent and unmoving. Richard's eyes locked onto Mason's like a predator spotting prey that had crawled back out of its grave. "Mason," he said softly. "I warned you what would happen if you came back." Clara stepped in front of Mason instinctively, though her legs were trembling. "Who are you?" she demanded, voice cracking. Richard smirked. "Someone who has been very patient." Mason stepped forward, gently pulling Clara behind him. "This is between us. Leave her out of it." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You left her to protect her. Admirable. Foolish. And now look, you've put her right back in danger." Clara looked between them, confusion and fear twisting her features. "Mason, what is happening?" He didn't answer. Because for the second time in his life, Mason Hale was being forced to make the hardest choice he had ever faced. And this time, there was no right answer. No path without ruin. No way out. Just consequences. And the choice he made next would change everything forever. You know, every time I finish telling a story like this, I end up thinking about how unpredictable life can be. How sometimes we think we're in control, but the truth is, we're all just one decision away from changing everything. And honestly, I've been in situations, nothing as dramatic as Mason's, but moments where I had to choose between what I wanted and what was right. Maybe you felt that too. If you made it all the way here, thank you. I mean that. These stories take time, emotion, and a lot of heart to tell, and knowing you're on the other side listening makes all the difference. I'm genuinely curious, what would you have done if you were in Mason's place? Would you have disappeared? Would you have fought back? Or would you have chosen something completely different? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you enjoy stories filled with tension, emotion, twists, and choices that haunt the characters long after the last sentence, consider subscribing. It helps this channel reach more people who love dark, emotional narratives just like you. Thank you for being here. Until the next story.